Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Nicola Judkovich, and I'm the Manager of Education and Public Programs here at the National Trust of Australia in Victoria. A warm welcome to you all. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting, the Wurundjeri people. I pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and acknowledge their continuing connections to land, waters, and community. I'd like to welcome you all to this event as part of the Australian Heritage Festival and National Archaeology Week. The National Trust of Australia in Victoria coordinates the Australian Heritage Festival in Victoria, which is the biggest annual community-driven heritage event in the state. 2024 is also the 50th anniversary of the state government heritage legislation in Victoria. The National Trust has partnered with the Heritage Council of Victoria to celebrate this milestone and the many important places and objects protected in the Victorian Heritage Register. This and many other festival events have been made possible through the Heritage Council of Victoria, their support for the 2024 Australian Heritage Festival. Today happens to be the final day of the Heritage Festival, and tomorrow is the beginning of National Archaeology Week, and we couldn't think of a more fitting event than the one that we have planned for you today. Shortly, we will begin with our expert panel discussion, and there'll be a time for Q&A after that, and then we'll move outside to a simulated archaeology dig, but more about that later. You may have noticed that this panel discussion is being recorded. The focus will be on the panellists, not yourselves, so that's good for you to know. But if you have any questions about that, please see us a bit later. Okay, I'd love to introduce you to our panellists. Let's start on the end there. Hi, Jeremy. Jeremy Smith is Heritage Victoria's Principal Archaeologist and is an Honorary Fellow in the Classics and Archaeology discipline at the University of Melbourne. He has worked on archaeological sites in the Middle East and across Australia. He has published widely on the subject of Victoria's historical archaeology with a focus on the archaeology of Melbourne. He was a key contributor to the award-winning book, Ned Kelly Under the Microscope. Hi, Karen. Dr. Karen Murphy is a historical archaeologist with over 20 years' experience in heritage consultancy, academia, and state government heritage management. She is currently the Technical Director for Archaeology and Cultural Heritage for global engineering and project delivery company Jacobs Group, and is the archaeology member of the Heritage Council of Victoria. She has excavated archaeological sites in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, Northern Territory, Sweden, San Francisco, and Turkey. Welcome, Janine. Dr. Janine Major is a PhD in archaeology from the La Trobe University and a mini MBA from the Australian Institute of Management. Her previous roles include Principal GML Heritage Victoria and Senior Manager Strategy and Operations for the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council. She has over 16 years' experience in archaeology and cultural heritage management and has worked on a range of historical and Aboriginal sites of local, state and world heritage significance. Hello, Georgia. Dr. Georgia Stannard is a lecturer in Australian Aboriginal archaeology at La Trobe University. Her research areas include the archaeology and paleo environments of Australia's cold climate landscapes, and she's a national leader in archaeological education. Georgia is currently co-chair of the Australian National Committee for Archaeology, Teaching and Learning. And hello, Caroline. Dr. Caroline Spry is archaeologist and heritage advisor who specialises in lithic technologies. She's an acting co-manager for the Cultural Heritage Unit, Wurundjeri Wurrung Cultural Heritage Aboriginal Corporation, adjunct senior research fellow in archaeology and La Trobe University, and co-chair of the National Archaeology Week in Australia. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today at glorious Como House. Okay, the first question for our panellists is for all the panellists. If you ask someone what springs to mind when they hear the words archaeology or archaeologist, they might say Indiana Jones, Time Team, or Old Bones, or even treasure. For our archaeology panellists here, how would you describe your current job and how did you end up becoming an archaeologist? Who would like to start?
We start down one end here. Thank you for that introduction, Nicola. So I work for Heritage Victoria. That's a state government department. I think in terms of archaeology, we have perhaps two key roles. We're responsible for recording archaeological sites across the state. We do shipwrecks as well as the historical archaeological sites. So we try to work out where the sites are located. And then if anybody's doing any work that's going to disturb or affect those sites, or if they want to do an excavation on those sites, they need to get an approval from us. So our role, it doesn't sound very exciting. It certainly doesn't sound very Indiana Jones. Our role sort of controlling the archaeology work that takes place in Victoria, making sure it happens when it needs to happen, and then making sure the archaeologists do a very good job when they come to the excavation. So it's sort of an administrative regulatory role. In terms of how I came to archaeology, my father's a doctor of history. I grew up very much with those stories of the Greek myths, the Iliad, Homer, Odyssey. I remember looking at pictures of minotaurs when I was sort of 3 or 4. And my love of history sort of stayed right through my childhood. When I went to university, I studied history and ancient history, and I just got drawn more and more to the ancient history. And I ended up doing some archaeology subjects at Melbourne University. The key opportunity for me came with the opportunity to do field work with the Melbourne University Archaeology program in Syria. So I worked for 4 years overseas up on the border of Syria and Turkey on the Euphrates River. And that was a defining moment for me. Having worked in that fabulous Iron Age site, 3,000-year-old site, I really couldn't turn my back on archaeology from then. There was a little process of retraining as an Australian archaeologist after that. And then got my opportunity with Heritage Victoria, I think about 25, 30 years ago, so back in the mid-1990s. Karen.
Thanks, Jeremy. My role is almost, I guess, working with Jeremy and his team. As a consultant, I and my team undertake work for clients such as state government departments, federal government departments, water authorities. So if someone wants to build a new road, a new rail line, a new pipeline, our team does background research, goes out in the field to survey, looks at what heritage might be there, where they want to build the new piece of infrastructure. We provide them advice on what they need to do, what permits they need from Heritage Victoria, or and then we will also do excavation as well. So we've got a team of about 40 archaeologists at Jacobs, and we work all around the country doing lots of different projects. And that's what I love about archaeology is the variety. I did a business degree straight out of high school and realised I didn't want to work in an office all the time for the rest of my life. And so I thought, what do I really want to do? And I'd always loved reading about the Incas and the Egyptians for me as a kid. And I just thought, and I love history. I've always loved Australian history and family history and doing research. So I went back to uni in my late 20s and studied archaeology. And once I started learning, like Jeremy, I couldn't stop. I just needed to learn more and more and more. Did my PhD at University of Queensland and then moved down here and started doing consulting. And yeah, I can't see me stopping anytime soon.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Karen. Yes, I work for Parks Victoria at the moment. And I say at the moment because I've had a bit of a career getting there. But my role is to advise on the archaeology within the Parks Victoria estate, which is huge. It's 4 million hectares. It covers something like 18% of Victoria's landmass. We have, I think we're up to 150 sites that are registered on the Victorian Heritage Register. We have almost 2,000 known recorded archaeological sites on the Parks estate, and there would be many more that we don't know about. So my role is to assist all the parks staff, of which there's well over 1,000, to understand their obligations in relation to the Heritage Act, to understand their obligations in relation to the management of archaeology in their particular patches, whether that's the local rangers or people working in major projects, doing big infrastructure projects on the estate. So I work both with Jeremy at Heritage Victoria, making sure that we're getting all the right processes in place, making sure we're compliant with those processes. And with companies like Karen's, we would then engage consultant archaeologists to actually prepare all the applications, to do the monitoring or the excavations on the areas that we may be impacting through the works that we're doing. So that's my role at Parks Victoria. And how I got into archaeology, a little bit like Karen, I came quite late to the party, but what a party it was. I'm certainly not leaving anytime soon either. I didn't finish school and did various jobs before sitting down one day and thinking, what do I really want to do with my life? And so I thought, well, I love history. And I thought I was going to major in ancient history, which I started studying. And I was looking for an elective to pick up, and I picked up archaeology. And I thought, wow, this actually really brings history alive. You're finding the little people, the voices that aren't heard in the historical narrative and the historical record sometimes. And I then cut my teeth as an archaeologist working on excavations in Cyprus. And then, like Jeremy, had to learn how to actually make a career back at home. And have been working in both historical and Aboriginal archaeological fields since.
Thank you so much, everybody, for those interesting insights so far. So I guess, like everyone else, my career in archaeology has been very varied as well. My role at the moment is as a lecturer in the Department of Archaeology and History, and there's a few of my students here today, so lovely to see you all. Pardon me. So I work at La Trobe, as I say, and that is in both a teaching and a research space. So I am involved in several research projects, working specifically in Australian Indigenous archaeology, doing surveying and excavation work, collaborating with traditional custodians to answer questions about country that they are interested in learning more about. The other big aspect of what I do is training future archaeology professionals, and this is a great joy of mine, is the education aspect of my job, being able to foster that interest and that passion in future archaeologists, give them the tools and the expertise that they need, and then send them out into the world to make a difference, particularly in the Indigenous archaeological space. I came to archaeology largely through, and thinking about this has probably informed my passion in teaching, through a passionate secondary history teacher at school, Mrs. Trish Top, who really inspired me to get into history and into archaeology and the multidisciplinarity that is archaeology, feeding it in with geography and science and history. And then once I started studying archaeology at the ANU in Canberra, I went on a field trip taught by Mr. Dave Johnson, an Indigenous archaeologist, and I was completely hooked, like my colleague, on archaeology, but also on Australia's Indigenous archaeology, which is so diverse and nuanced and complex, and none of this stuff is things that we learn about in school. So that's really inspired me to become an educator myself and foster that passion in other people. Go on.
Thank you, Georgia. I currently work at Wurundjeri Wurrung Cultural Heritage Aboriginal Corporation in their Cultural Heritage Unit. They have many different units. Some of you might have attended a smoking ceremony or a welcome to country that may have been given by a Wurundjeri elder. That's our events unit. I work in the unit that deals with requirements under the Aboriginal Heritage Act in Victoria, which is a piece of legislation that was enacted in 2006. And it's about protecting Victoria's Aboriginal cultural heritage. And it recognises the Wurundjeri Wurrung people and their country, but these people as the decision makers for anything relating to cultural heritage in the Wurundjeri registered Aboriginal party area. So we do very many different things in that unit at Wurundjeri, but I work very closely every day with 3 Wurundjeri elders, Ron Jones, Bobby Mullins and Alan Wandon, and a whole team of archaeologists. We run a lot of meetings with external stakeholders who want to consult with the elders about cultural heritage on Wurundjeri country. A lot of these projects are development projects, so housing estates, roads, North East Link project, the train line to the Melbourne Airport that everybody's been hearing about. Sometimes those projects require people to go through stages of investigation where they come in and talk to the elders, and they might do some background research, go out and do a walk around or a survey, some archaeological excavation, and then have a discussion with the elders at the end about what they've found and how they can manage it during that development project.
but also repatriation. People may have found some artifacts or held them in their family for many years. We recently had someone with a boomerang that had been in their family for a long time, recovered from an extinct volcanic cone, Mount Fraser, which is in Beveridge in Melbourne, which erupted 800,000 years ago and made a lot of stony rise landforms that are still apparent across Victoria today. And they wanted to return that boomerang to Wurundjeri. And I help Wurundjeri manage their very many or thousands of archaeological sites that are registered in their RAF area, their registered Aboriginal Party area, which can include tiny little stone artefacts, stone quarries. There are some large 20-metre circular earth rings in Sunbury called the Sunbury Earth Rings that are thought to be ceremonial rings that date to at least 1,500 years ago. Some recent dating has revealed. And a stone axe quarry, a very tough stone called greenstone, which is actually a National Heritage listed site near Lancefield, where the stone was used to make polished axes and traded across Australia. And then further to the east, in Laughing Waters, you've got some stone features in water that were used for fish traps and a whole host of other things. So it's a very diverse, interesting job, and I work closely with the elders every day on that.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you all for helping us understand the huge scope for this fascinating field of work in Victoria and well beyond. Obviously, a really big part of archaeology traditionally is the study of material culture and material remains of the past. Could you help us understand a bit more about that? Starting with you, Jeremy, can you give us an example of a key find or a project that will help us understand a bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm slightly concerned that my examples are not going to dispel this myth that we're all Indiana Jones out there looking for treasures and old bones. I mean, I'm very, very fortunate, I think, as an archaeologist. Some of the projects I've been involved in are just remarkable. I think you're lucky if you get one of these projects in your whole working life, and I'm very fortunate to have had a few. In my time in Syria, I was literally heading out to our site, and I was the first one from the Melbourne University team that was going out to our site on the Euphrates River to set the dig, to open up the mud brick cottages that we've got there that we were using as a base. And the day before I got there, the locals had been irrigating their cotton crop, and all of a sudden the ground had just collapsed beneath them, and all the water that they were irrigating the field with had disappeared down what looked to them like a giant plug hole about 2 metres below ground level. And they'd never seen this before. This was a village community. The site we're working at, Tel Akbar, it's got no running water, it's got no electricity. So it's a very, very much out in the middle of nowhere, little village out in the Syrian desert, really. And the locals took me out the next day. It just happened I'd arrived the day after this had happened. And I remember peering down into this hole in the ground, and I could see something in there that looked like brick or even looked like cement. And I went down into the hole, which was perhaps not a sensible thing to do. And I remember looking around, and I was in this chamber, and it felt to me, my initial reaction, which I still remember, was I'm in some sort of sewage pipe, because it was so beautifully built. Vaulted ceiling, brick structures everywhere. But then, of course, I thought again, well, there's no way there's any service infrastructure out here. This cannot be modern. And in fact, what it was an Assyrian burial chamber. So it was a vaulted tomb. You think a little bit about Tutankhamun, it's not quite as elaborate as that, but it was a beautiful underground burial chamber. The water channel had crashed through the roof, actually. But we later, when I excavated the remains of the structure, we found a set of stairs that were leading up to ground level. So the tomb it was about 3,000 years old. It related to the Iron Age period. It was part of the Assyrian civilization. The Assyrians were mainly based in Iraq, but they had some satellite settlements in places like Syria as part of their trading empire. And so here we were in this provincial city of the Assyrian Empire, and obviously part of the village was used as a sort of royal tomb cemetery for that part of the community. Fortunately for me, no one else in our team wanted to go into the tomb. We thought it was quite precarious, but in fact it was so well built that it stood the test of time. And the more we excavated, the more we realised it's not going to collapse at any time. So my job for that season, for the 3 months that we were there, was to work inside the tomb, gradually excavate it out, record it all. And of course, the Syrian desert's very hot. It's about 45 degrees every day. But down in my tomb, which was still quite wet from all the water, was this beautiful environment, was very cool. Other than the threat of the whole thing collapsing, it was a wonderful place to work. The tomb had been robbed, unfortunately, probably by the Persian Empire that followed on from the Assyrians in around 600 BC. But it still was a wonderful work of construction. Coffin, the baked clay coffin, was still there. There were some artefacts. It just wasn't quite the riches of Tutankhamun that we were thinking we might have found when it was originally discovered. So that was really my Indiana Jones moment. I was very lucky to do that. My other project that I've again been very fortunate was the work at Pentridge, where, as you probably know, the Kennett government sold Pentridge off for private sale in the late 1990s. And it was known that there were quite a few prisoners executed and buried at Pentridge in the 20th century. Some of you will know Ronald Ryan, of course. But what's less well known is that a lot of executed inmates, their remains were moved across from the old Melbourne jail to Pentridge in about 1929. There were about 40 of those individuals, including Ned Kelly. And the location of those remains was not well recorded at Pentridge. Janine made reference to archaeology finding these stories of the impoverished individual. Well, the stories are not well reflected in traditional histories. And the inmates at Pentridge fall into that category. Their burial sites, the mass graves that they were buried in, were not well located. So that was a job that Heritage Victoria was given to do by the government. Can you please work out where all the burials are at Pentridge prior to this development taking place? And so our role, working with some consultants, doing some research ourselves, was to work out where these undocumented burials were located. We managed to do that. The main breakthrough was using aerial photography from the 1950s that showed this neglected little bit of land overgrown with weeds that looked like a good fit for us. We did some archaeology there, and eventually over time, the mass graves were found. The DNA was done on some of the remains, and through that project, we were able to identify the remains of Ned Kelly. So it's a great answer for an archaeologist to have. What's the most interesting thing you found? Well, I can say, well, Ned Kelly. So I feel very lucky with that. So they're my two examples, a wonderful project in the Middle East through Melbourne Uni and the rediscovery of the mass graves of the prisoners out at Pentridge.
Thank you, Jeremy. Karen, what about you?
Mine's much closer to home and much closer in time. And it kind of reflects Janine's mention before about, the little things or the everyday people in history that don't get their stories told in histories, but we can find out something about them. And that's what I love the most about historical archaeology, is understanding how people in Australia lived, over the last couple of hundred years. So my PhD project was actually looking at a 19th century sawmill settlement up in southeast Queensland on the shores of Lake Catharaba, about half an hour from Noosa. In the sort of 1870s, 1880s, it was in the middle of absolute nowhere, in a forest by a lake. All the history is about the mill exploding or about the men that set up the mill company, because they were big names in the gold rush in Queensland at the time. But what I was interested in was there was a whole private township at this location, and now it's a national park, and it's quite bushy. You wouldn't actually know that a whole group of people lived there for 20 or 30 years, and the vast majority of them were women and children. So it was families, but you don't see them in the written stories about this place. So by looking at, we had historical photos. There was one amazing panoramic photo taken from the top of the mill building in the 1880s. So pretty elaborate technology for that time. So we could kind of figure out, because we had the lake in the background and the big Kalula sand mass in the background of the photo, we could actually figure out where we thought the houses for the workers were. And we started digging there. I had lots of student volunteers helping me. In the, February in Queensland is not necessarily the most fun place to be excavating. There were plenty of mozzies and leeches and ticks. But we found very small remains of their lifestyle. And one I particularly remember was actually excavating one day and finding a woman's earring. Like it was this beautiful metal drop earring with a little pink stone in it. And I just thought, the woman that lost this out on the edge of nowhere in southeast Queensland would have been devastated. And I've now found this, it's I find a tangible connection to people of the past, that really personal stories. We also found little ceramic dolls, marbles. So you can imagine, the kids of the mill settlement and what they were doing. We found evidence of people doing watercolour painting, all kinds of things. So it was that's what I like about historical archaeology, is that the small things can tell stories about the everyday people.
Thank you. Big thank you for helping us understand all the different pathways to archaeology and the stories that we can uncover. Looking forward, there are many challenges facing archaeology and archaeologists. Jeremy, back to you. What sort of challenges are you finding in the historical archaeology space?
Look, I think the challenges in historical archaeology, there are opportunities as well. Some of you will remember the little Long Dig of 1988-89 in Melbourne, and that was really seen as the starting point of archaeology in Victoria, at least in a historical sense. There'd been a few small projects before that, but only a handful of excavations had taken place anywhere in Victoria before that time. And in fact, after that dig, there was nothing for another 10 years as well. So we almost go back to the year around 2000 for when archaeology started to become commonplace throughout Victoria. So the first challenge was getting archaeology happen at all. If there was development work, why was archaeology going to be needed? And there's a sort of discussion about legislation being passed and about the development of bodies like Heritage Victoria, which managed to get archaeology happening. And in fact, now, even in the Melbourne City, we've had about 300 digs done since that time. So the answer to the question really is this evolution of how do you get archaeology happening in the first place? And that's about legislation. It's about dealing with lawyers and planners, making sure people understand the need for archaeology. But then it's about why you're doing it. How are you making the results of archaeology important? How are you making them available to the public? Why are you doing it? It's developing expertise amongst people like Janine and Karen about how can your people excavate sites efficiently and effectively, and explain why this is important. What are we finding? And now I think the challenge is things like moving beyond the archaeology just of Melbourne. We're doing a study in Ballarat, which has revealed that the archaeological sites there are really remarkable. They're very well preserved, but we've never had much archaeology done in Ballarat. That's going to change over the next 5 years or so. I think Ballarat will become like Melbourne. Archaeology will be common, and it'll be well understood that there's significant archaeology there. Other townships like Beechworth and Bendigo and the archaeology of the goldfields, you'll be hearing much, much more about that. So there's always a new bar to cross, bar to reach, really. There's a development to the profession. It's changed so much in the last 30 years. So I think these are challenges, but there are opportunities as well. Victoria has a really remarkable archaeology. It survives in great condition in a number of places. And it's about how we manage to make sure the archaeology happens, but like today, that the results are presented back to the public as well. So it's as much about community engagement. So I think they're the challenges that I see, but they're very exciting ones.
And Caroline, are you facing similar issues in the Aboriginal archaeology space here in Victoria?
Good question. Thank you, Nicola. So I'd say a pertinent challenge at the moment, but I'd like to also think of it as an opportunity, as Jeremy says, is of course the question of development and heritage. And for example, housing and heritage. Housing's a very big topic in Australia at the moment, and housing supply. There's a housing crisis. More people need homes, housing affordability, and where does heritage come into this? And that's not just something that's particular to Aboriginal cultural heritage. It goes across all heritage. I know National Trust have also released some communications about this recently and dispelling myths around the value of heritage. So everybody's obviously got a different sense of what heritage is and the value of heritage and the significance of it. Working for a registered Aboriginal party at the moment for Wurundjeri Wurrung Cultural Heritage Aboriginal Corporation, there have been some media articles at the moment talking about how there have been delays in the housing process due to the need to investigate whether there's Aboriginal cultural heritage present at these locations and work out how to manage that during the development activity. So it's interesting because the way it's being put in the media at the moment probably doesn't reflect what's actually accurately happening. For example, less than 1% of all developments that require a planning permit actually require someone to go through a process where they consult with Wurundjeri, for example. So we're only talking about a very small percentage, less than 1% of all planning permit projects. And a lot of those projects don't end up finding anything either. But at Wurundjeri at the moment, we're working hard to make sure that we're well resourced internally so we can do our consultation with people in a timely manner. And we're also working hard with the government, for example, with the Victorian Planning Authority, to make sure that we can identify Aboriginal cultural values very early on in the planning process so that everybody's aware of them and they can factor that into their development processes. And a lot of these development projects, for example, building a new housing estate or an entire new suburb, we're talking about projects that can take 10 to 20 years anyway. So they're not just waiting on their approvals for Aboriginal cultural heritage, they're dealing with a multitude of factors, but it is a difficult industry for those developers to be in at the moment. There are a lot of variables and a lot of challenges, but I think for the elders I work with, Ron, Ellen, Bobby, who I mentioned earlier at Wurundjeri, it's about working together, working with developers. We've got a great relationship with a lot of developers. For example, Stockland, we're working closely with the government to constantly improve our processes, make sure that cultural values are identified early, and we're encouraging people to talk to us early. If they have a planned development in mind, come and talk to the elders. Those early conversations are really beneficial in terms of understanding how you can work together if there is something there to avoid it and still be able to carry out your development activity. And a lot of the time, it's a process of give and take. So if you do find something, you're probably still going to be able to do your development activity. It might just be a few little modifications here or there, or sometimes if you're building a very large housing estate that's got hundreds of new homes planned, maybe the elders, if something was found, might ask you to put a heritage park in a place where a scatter of stone artefacts was found. And it's also about education, I guess, working together with the public and everybody to understand what is Aboriginal cultural heritage and educating younger people about that as well. I know when I was at school early on, I didn't learn so much about Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander history in Australia, and that's now changing, and that's maybe a nice little segue for Georgia to talk about challenges as well. Thanks, Caroline. Yes, there are so many challenges and as well opportunities. I think we're really reaching a point now where that the time is now to create this space to learn more about our deep time Australian story, particularly with the release of the Australian curriculum, the new Australian curriculum version 9 a couple of years ago in 2022. Now includes a specific core unit entitled Deep Time History of Australia. And this is the first time that we have a core unit in Year 7 that is required, where we, going through school, would learn about the pre-colonial history of Australia. So I'm going to take a punt and say most of you here today did not learn very much about the very rich and complex history that is Australian history before colonisation. We're talking 65, potentially 70,000 years up until today. And as a result of that lack of information, we have sort of come entrenched in stereotypes and misunderstandings about what that very long and complex record looked like, the immense environmental change to country through time and how people developed social and technological innovations to deal with that change in country, the management of country as well. And so from a primary and secondary school perspective, we have this opportunity to educate an entire generation of young Australians in the full depth of Australia's history. It's not a history of Indigenous culture and a history of colonial culture. It's a history of all Australians that we as the Australian public need to learn more about and appreciate, and start dispelling some of those myths that have become ingrained over generations. So that's certainly one of those aspects. And one of the things we're doing through both National Archaeology Week with Caroline and through the Australian National Committee for Archaeology Teaching and Learning, is developing a whole range of resources to get into schools to support teachers who themselves have not traditionally been trained in archaeological methods and analyses, to have them feel more confident in including this history into their classrooms, and doing a better job at translating our research into more accessible content that might be through audiovisual resources or blog posts or articles in The Conversation. Just breaking down those barriers between academia and the research and the public and the communities who relate to those archaeologies. So that's, I guess, the primary and secondary space. The other great challenge and opportunity in archaeological education lies within our tertiary institutions, particularly since the release of the Job Ready Graduate Scheme, which I won't begin that unpacking of today. See me afterwards. Which has led to the huge increase in costs for humanities students enrolling in archaeology degrees, which are now equivalent with law and result in very many thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars for student debt to study humanities. In an effort to dissuade students from studying humanities and move them into sciences, what we've seen, happily, for us, unfortunately for student debt, is a swing more towards humanities. So it's failed significantly. But, what we're seeing as a result too is a reduction in financial support for teaching this very vocational field that is archaeology. I like the analogy of you wouldn't train a plumber in the theory of plumbing and then expect them to go out and fix your plumbing. Same as in archaeology, we don't just teach the theory of how to do excavations and scientific analyses and interpretations. You actually have to get out on country and do it either in a historic archaeological context or working on field schools with community to learn about those skills and in practice. So those field school opportunities are becoming increasingly rare, which is, has a follow-on effect to how we as archaeologists are learning our trade and practicing that into the future. So I guess there's some of the real challenges and potential opportunities in how we can move forward and shape those different aspects in the next few years.
Great. I think we're going to jump in actually and just say another challenge is we need more archaeologists. So if you know anyone who's got an interest, send them off to do an archaeology degree because the industry is crying out for it and you can be well paid across a variety of very interesting jobs.
Okay, so you obviously recommend archaeology as a profession. Anyone else? What about you, Janine? What would you say?
Look, absolutely. I think you can see probably all of us would say we'd recommend archaeology as a profession. Not only is it fun, but it is incredibly interesting and incredibly rewarding. And one of the really rewarding things is actually the public engagement, I think, and we see that during times like the Australian Heritage Festival opportunities. I know, parks, we open up a lot of our places on the estate to the general public to look at our heritage places. We do offer field school opportunities too, so maybe we need to have a bit more of a talk about that. Jeremy, you might be interested in participating in that too. So I think from the panel here, you can see that archaeology offers professions in a range of categories. So here we've got examples of state government with myself and Jeremy. So you've got Heritage Victoria, you've got Parks Victoria, you've got First Peoples State Relations, the old Aboriginal Victoria. You've got the Department of Environment, Climate Change and Action. They all have heritage advisors, and many of those are archaeologists. You have Karen representing the private consulting world. Archaeologists can go out on their own business as freelancers. They can join small and mega heritage companies that might be small local firms. They might be international firms with an Australian branch. You've got the education sector with Georgia here that's doing a great job in educating the up and coming, and often there's opportunity for those students as part of their degree. And I think Carol and Georgia and I have all come through La Trobe, and we've probably all cut our teeth on tutoring and filling in lecturing and perhaps subject coordinating, and definitely as research assistants to the academics out there. And then of course there's career academics. And then you've got the other sphere that Caroline's working in the Aboriginal cultural heritage space. So it's a multifaceted profession, and it's one that's full of opportunities. And for any budding archaeologists out there, I would recommend just walking through any of those opportunity doors that open and see what it has to offer.
Thanks, Janine. So many pathways, many opportunities. It's now you now have an opportunity to ask the panel any questions that have been brewing over this panel discussion. Would anyone like to kick us off? Who has a question? I will bring the roving mic to you.
Thank you. Just a question about, I guess we're all coming to grips with technology, things like artificial intelligence, new ways of mapping, drones. I'm just interested in how the panel may have seen some of our recent technological developments affect their profession.
I mean, I'll dive in on that one. It was actually the point I was thinking when Janine gave that wonderful discussion about the different agencies and companies that employ archaeologists. It's also the point that the nature of archaeology within those firms is so diverse. Don't just think of an archaeologist as someone who goes and excavates. We're increasingly seeing such diversity. You might be called an archaeologist, but you may never leave the laboratory. You might be someone that loves doing artifact analysis. You may be someone, in answer to the question, that is an expert with photogrammetry, those sort of wonderful recreations you see on Time Team. They're done by people with computer science skills. They've still got an archaeology background, but their skill set may be in IT systems, increasingly in AI. We're seeing virtual reality, of course, in archaeology all the time. Archaeologists rely on researchers. If you're a good historian, a good researcher, a good writer, then that's an important skill in archaeology. So it's a wonderful profession for people that like getting outdoors and doing survey work, walking through the valleys and finding sites that no one's ever recorded before. It's great fun when you do the excavation and you find things. But the other roles of archaeology, the recording of a place, explaining why it's important, engaging with other people, this is all the field of archaeology as well. And I think the new technologies, we're already seeing them enhance the work that we do through these new applications. Ground penetrating radar has been around for a while. LiDAR, this sort of aerial photography that can identify archaeological sites. It's almost like X-raying from space below ground. It's remarkable. We're using it all the time now. So I think the profession is changing. It's becoming more accurate in a way, more efficient, certainly more exciting. And it's appealing to a broader range of students that might have skills and interests in those areas.
If I could just add to that too, Jeremy, I think we're seeing those skills also being applied to the marine environment. And that's something none of us probably have direct experience in. But of course, there is the branch of maritime archaeology. And we've been very excited recently to work with Heritage Victoria in what's going to become a 3D video footage of one of the shipwrecks down at Wilson's Promontory. So you'll all be able to go online and do a virtual tour. So, that's a new technology. Once upon a time, that would not have been accessible to anybody but the diver who actually went down there and had a look at them themselves.
Any other questions from the audience?
Would any of the panel like to talk about the interface you have with the people who present? You found some artefacts and they finish up in a museum, or there's a site that's going to be open to the public. How you fit in with that side, the next step?
I can probably answer that. We at Parks Victoria, we have been callaborating with Heritage Victoria, the Australian National University, and a consulting company called Heritage Insight on a field school down at Cape Shank for the past 3 years. And one of the permitting conditions on that, the permits that are granted through Heritage Victoria, said that we should engage in a program of public engagement. And so last, it was summer, I think it was this year, we actually did have an open day down at Cape Shank, and I think we had a couple of hundred people come through for the day, and they were able to actually tour it was just a small site, but the stables from the original lighthouse station there where the family would have lived, the floor of the stables has been completely exposed, and people were able to talk to the archaeologists there, the student archaeologists, as well as the directors there. They were able to look at the artefacts and learn about the artefacts that were found. They were able to talk about the process of excavation. It's very methodical. It's quite cathartic. It's a bit like gardening sometimes. I find you get really immersed in it. And we also had the maritime archaeologists from Heritage Victoria there. They brought down some of the maritime archaeological artefacts that had been found on the local shipwreck. So it was a really engaging day. At the moment, as part of Heritage Festival and National Archaeology Week, we've been running archaeological discovery tours in Yarra Bend, which of course is the site of the first lunatic asylum in Melbourne. And a few years back now, not that long ago, the state government gave significant funding for the development of netball courts over an area that, when we did our due diligence, was part of the area of the asylum where there was the old hospital and one of the wards. And through that process, we engaged external consultants to do the excavations there. Significant archaeology was found. So we actually talk about that in the tour, and we take them across the whole site with maps showing all the buildings that would have been there and what's likely to still survive. So there are opportunities for engagement, certainly through the experience that I've had, but others have probably done things as well.
Yeah, I can jump into one. With Wurundjeri. So a couple of examples. One is everybody might be familiar with the Melbourne Metro Tunnel project that's going to end up in North Melbourne and start, south of the CBD or at the War Memorial even. They found quite a few archaeological sites in that process, a lot of historical archaeological material, but also some Aboriginal places where people sat with different types of stone and made stone tools, or brought marine shell to a location, and that was buried deep below the ground and uncovered when people were excavating for the Melbourne Metro Tunnel project. So at the moment, we're having some consultation with the elders and the people doing that project, where they're going to create a permanent display out of some of the artefacts that were found. And in one case, there are lots of little bits of chipped stone that you can actually put together like a jigsaw puzzle. I was able to refit them back together to see the original bit of stone that a Wurundjeri person started with and how they chipped all the little bits off and the little tools that they made. That's going to go on permanent display. And there's another exhibition as well currently at the State Library of Victoria. William Barrack is an important Wurundjeri Wurrung ancestor. So a lot of the things that he made and used are now on exhibition there. And the people who put together that exhibition have consulted with Wurundjeri elders in that process. William Barrack is an important Narangita or headman of the Wurundjeri people. And he's also one of their old ancestors, a great-great-great uncle. I probably need to add a couple more greats on. So we have a lot of engagement for a lot of those types of exhibitions on a weekly basis at Wurundjeri, and it's a lovely thing to do when people go out and do all these excavations to make something of it and to be used for education purposes.
There's perhaps one that I could recommend people could go and look, and Jeremy, that would be the Little Lon artifacts that you might like to talk about.
It's often a condition we write on our permits that require archaeology is that the results of the project must get returned in some way. In fact, if you walk through that block that Janine's talking about, that sort of Little Lon block of Melbourne, almost every building, every foyer has got an archaeology display in it relating to that 19th century history of that area. Almost the entire block there's been excavated by archaeologists going back to 1988-89, a major project in 2002 when the Custleton Plate 50 Lonsdale Street building was done. So they're the sort of more intimate displays. They make sense because the artefacts are being displayed in the area where they were found, where they belong, really. So there's a permanent display at Melbourne Museum on the archaeology of early Melbourne, but those artefacts have moved. They weren't found there. So I think it's great to have displays that result from the archaeological process themselves, and we will often require that as a condition on the approvals that we give.
Could I possibly add one final one? Thinking about engagement directly with archaeological methods and understanding more about what archaeologists do. I'm partnering with the National Trust here at Como and at Barwon Grange at the moment we've developed some simulated archaeological sites where school groups get to come in and have some education sessions with real life archaeologists, archaeology students learning at university, who facilitate an experience where they get to excavate a simulated site and then interpret the artifacts and come up with their own ideas about what those artifacts represent. And so taking the theory out of archaeology and making it hands-on and real really helps these students to understand. And the National Trust was recently successful for a strategic partnerships program grant with the Department of Education here in Victoria to take our incursion programs and these excursions out to low socioeconomic schools and into the regions and rural Victoria to allow all these kids who would not ordinarily have an opportunity to engage in hands-on archaeology with specialists, this opportunity to get that experience for no cost, which is really exciting stuff. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, wonderful talks, wonderful descriptions, thanks. Is there a role for volunteers in archaeology? And if so, what is it? What does it encompass? Because the range of tasks you've described here is enormous.
I'm just jumping pretty quickly to say I think we probably all started as volunteers in one way or another. My very first dig Jeremy set me off on, I was doing a bit of work for him, a student internship, and it was where Ned Kelly and the gang had the final encounter with the police up at Glenrowan, and I was a student volunteer on that dig with some La Trobe University students, and that led me to meet professional archaeologists and understand that there was a career and a pathway in archaeology, and eventually those introductions and networks, I guess, resulted in some paid work, and I've progressed and moved into Aboriginal archaeology, but Jeremy was a big role in my early beginnings and volunteer work.
I mean, it is a challenging question as well, because in a way, our beginnings were in volunteer work, but you don't really have volunteer work as a cornerstone of most professional industries, architects and lawyers. And really, there are restraint of trade issues associated with using a volunteer to do the job that a paid employee should do. So back in the Little Lon dig of 88, 89, it was all done by volunteers, but you couldn't do that today. So you often get a very good experience as a student at university working on excavation. So you're not paid to do that, but it's part of your accreditation and part of your degree. But as you say, the role of the volunteer going on site, doing excavation closely supervised by someone, or even doing work looking at the artifacts after the dig and sorting them, look, those roles have sort of diminished. On one hand, it's very sad because it's a tradition that archaeologists have had for centuries. On the other hand, it is actually a reflection that the profession is maturing. And what it means is that there is a pathway, exactly what Caroline talked about. You can come in now as a young archaeologist. After you've done your 2 to 3 years of study, you can actually get paid on site as a junior archaeologist. And then you might do that for 5 years, and then you get an ongoing role at a higher level. And that's the pathway for archaeology that exists now, where there are opportunities at every level, but it's a professional scale. So it's unfortunate, really, because I volunteered on projects, and every generation before me, that's what they did. But unfortunately, if we were to employ volunteers now instead of archaeologists at Heritage Victoria, one of those volunteers could go to Fair Work Australia, and they could say they should have been paid $40 an hour to do that work, and they would win that case. So it's a bit of a changing of the tides, really. But deep down, I think it's showing that the profession is moving from a part-time basis to something more professional.
And it might be interesting, George, I was just thinking young and old. We get a lot of interest young and old. A lot of people have always been interested in archaeology. And I might ask you your experiences in education of that. Yeah, I would say it's almost half and half now. We have many people have, particularly post-pandemic, decided whatever role they were doing beforehand is not for them, and now is the time to make a change, I cannot tell you the number of people who have said to me, "Oh, you're an archaeologist. I always wanted to be an archaeologist, and now I'm an accountant," or whatever it might be. I think if everyone who wanted to do archaeology professionally did it, we would be swarmed with archaeologists and everyone would be an archaeologist. But yes, I think there is definitely a shift, and there are so many opportunities now to do not necessarily practical components of archaeology, but to learn about archaeological theory and methods and analyses through things like standalone subjects at university, or even through free MOOCs, mass online open courses that you can do on the internet, which are provided by, there's an excellent one, for example, by the University of Durham in the UK, that you can just sign up to, and you get access to these world-class lectures, and there's little practical components that you can do, in a virtual environment and muck around with artifacts, and it costs absolutely nothing. And so there is an increasing drive for these sorts of opportunities to come about. And certainly archaeological community digs are much more common in the UK, particularly. I was just thinking when Jeremy was making his comments that one of, I think, our realizations in more recent years is with the move away from particularly excavation work is the ethical obligations we have. Whenever we do excavations, we're destroying the archaeology that we're excavating. So particularly for Indigenous heritage, to run an excavation which was not a requirement under impending destruction by development or infrastructure works or something, really sort of limits us in what we would consider to be a justification for excavation. But in saying that, though, there are some particularly more historic sites where there might be an opportunity, if it's looking for infrastructure works, that could be run as a community volunteer project under something like perhaps the National Trust. But they're very uncommon at the moment, as Jeremy said. And there are, just to finish, some paid field schools that you could go on. There's an excellent one at the Chinese Harried Field, Chinese camp, where you can go away for a week or up to a month, I think, and do some excavation work, and the fees are just to cover accommodation and food and things, and that's a volunteer-led project with archaeologists, and they'll train you in how to do things. But yeah, there's certainly a range of opportunities available. Yeah.
We have time for one more.
Hi, thank you, everyone. It's been so interesting, and I am one of those people who want to do an archaeologist, but for whatever reason, went into law instead. Funnily enough, perfect example, living example. What I wanted to also talk about, we see a lot of archaeology glamorized, right? And we're starting to see a bit more of what it really is like. For example, on Netflix, they have Saqqara in Egypt, where you see archaeologists on the ground doing the highs and lows. What are some of the lows of archaeology? Because we always see the highs.
Where do we begin, really? Hot, wet, outside, snake bites, spider bites. Look, I think, working in Australia, one of the big limitations we often hear about when we say to people we're archaeologists, oh, it must be interesting to work in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, somewhere else. One of the, I think, exciting things about working in Australia is the diversity of places you can go. We are paid very well in Australia. If you're working in the UK, you could be paid very tiny amounts. So I feel like we have a really nice place here in Australia where we're well paid. Our conditions are really good. We're trained well. We have reasonable expectations of how hot or how cold or how wet or disgusting it can be outside before we pull the pin. So I feel like, having been in Australian archaeology for a while, if you're not an outdoors person, you can specialise in lab work or analyses that, don't take you out into the field. It is such a diverse, as Jeremy said before, such a hugely diverse field. I say to the students who come in, high school students come in, if you are interested in any subject at school and also interested in history, this could be the profession for you, because you can combine literally anything with history and archaeology, and you can be an archaeologist. So you need not, as I say, you need not force yourself out into a blizzard. Tick that box. I've done that before. Or, burn your backside on a rock in the Pilbara, which I've also done. So these, you can really tailor your experience of archaeology to your interests and I guess your tolerances as well. Does anyone want to add to that?
Well, I guess it does test your limits at times, and perhaps I'll just share a very quick experience, which at the time seemed like a low, but really was a remarkable experience, and it sort of builds on Jeremy's Middle Eastern experience. So there was I mentioned earlier cutting my teeth in excavations in Cyprus, and it was a little bit like Tut's tomb in as much as I felt like we'd unleashed a curse. Some kind of mummy's curse. So we were excavating in Bronze Age tombs at the time, and one by one, people started getting very sick, very, very sick. I mean, very, very, very sick. And it turned out, and it felt a little bit like living in some kind of Dickensian novel. Like you'd wake up in the morning thinking, is it my turn today to not be well? And then we reached critical mass, and there was a day when nobody got sick. And then there was a second day when nobody got sick. I happened to be one of those, which my family thought was hysterical because I've had every childhood disease known to man pretty much. And anyway, it turned out that we had typhus, the one you can't be vaccinated against. So I was getting confused, typhus. And we couldn't work out how people were actually getting it. And it turned out that we knew there were rats around, but no one's being bitten by the rats. And some people had a rash, other people didn't. And very, very high temperature. And the World Health Organization did get involved. And there was all these investigations going on. Why are people getting sick? It turned out that so if you think archaeology, you're digging in soft sediment, you're sieving, you're ingesting. We probably weren't wearing the mask that we should have been. So our health and safety standards overseas aren't as strict as they are here in Australia. And we were probably being a little bit lax on that. Turns out that we weren't being bitten by the rats, we weren't being bitten by the fleas, we were ingesting the flea feces. And that's how people were getting sick. But doesn't it make a great story? So that's the upside. That's the upside to the low. At the time, it was pretty low, I've got to admit. It was a little bit scary. But yeah.
I'm so pleased from there. I'm so pleased we made time for that one final question. Big thank you to you all for your time today, for opening our minds and hearts to archaeology. Big thank you to you in the audience for your for attending and for your questions. Can we please thank our panellists with a round of applause?